Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh is the
Dr. Doreen is an expert in autism.
Doreen Granpeesheh.
Dr. Granpeesheh.
Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh.
Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh is a visionary in the field of autism. Now you can ask her questions on Ask Dr. Doreen. At the start of the hour, Michael wanted to know, he's from Philadelphia with a 9-year-old son. He wants to know your thoughts on stem cell treatment.
Right. That was a great question, Michael. And, there are more and more developments nowadays for use of stem cell across all different types of illnesses. But unfortunately, we're not quite there yet with autism. It is something that I think you would have to go outside of the US to try to investigate a little bit more. Personally, I'm not ready to recommend stem cell treatment at this point for autism. And that's only because, we don't even know what truly causes ASD in every single individual. We do know that ASD is to some extent related to the genetic component of ASD. Let's say ASD has both a genetic predisposition as well as kind of an environmental trigger that works with that genetic component. And what we do know is that, the genetic component has something to do with the ability to detoxify rapidly enough, as we all do, redox cycle. And we also know that there are tons of toxins in our environment, right? So too many that I can't even name anymore. There was a time where we would be able to identify and say, oh yeah, we're just talking about plastics, or we're just talking about, antibiotics, or we're talking about pesticides, or whatever it is. But there's a lot of toxicity in our environment, and sometimes it's just very hard to be able to put your finger on exactly what is the trigger for each individual. Until you can do that, you can't really be messing too much with stem cell treatment. Now, that being said, one of the things I recently read, Shannon, which is kind of exciting, and I'm interested in learning more, is that there's also a lot of research now after having used messenger RNA for COVID, which it's referred to as a COVID vaccine, but I can't see how messenger RNA would be called a vaccine. It's not really a vaccine. But it's interesting because now the same kind of procedures are being used to look at things like cancer and other types of health issues. And I'm hoping that very soon that whole direction, in fact, it just makes sense to me that that entire process of using messenger RNA will contribute in the future to the treatment of things like redox and how it's affecting our brain. And I will say for our viewers, a lot of times, and Shannon, you know this, we hear the same things and it's 20 years later or 30 years later, right? And it's parents who are now experiencing it for the first time. Meanwhile, we've been hearing this for years and years and years, and it's just gotten a bit worse. So I'll tell our viewers that, back in the, let's say, 90s or so, it was just the beginning of people realizing how toxic our environment has become. It was the very, very beginning. In fact, one of my patients who was very, very ill and lived in South Africa, we were trying to get him food that did not contain gluten. And it was almost impossible. It was literally almost impossible. You couldn't find it. You could barely find like flour that you could, almond flour or something, so that we could send it to South Africa so they could bake and so on. And now, in the United States and many countries, you can go to any restaurant and say, I want the gluten-free version. And so the world has become a lot more, this issue of something like gluten, or, the toxicity that comes, or the inability to digest from gluten, has affected so many people, not just spectrum, across the board. And inflammation of the gut, which was a major, major issue in autism back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, is now so prevalent that it has become something people are paying attention to and finally modifying in order for us to be able to survive, right? And so when you look at back in the 90s, there were very few Whole Foods places, very few places you could get these things. And now it's just pretty common. In fact, I often say, you know, when we were growing up, or even in the 90s, there were no commercials on TV for probiotics or prebiotics, you know, and now everybody's struggling with some form of inflammation. So our unfortunately, and specifically unfortunately for our kids on the spectrum, it's just harder and harder to live a healthy life and to not have to deal with inflammation, which then causes some of these other issues.
Thanks for watching Autism Live. If you found anything helpful in this video, please give us a like. In fact, make sure that you smash that subscribe button on YouTube and give us a like on Facebook. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram for important updates. And please download our free podcast wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time. Until then, give your kiddos a hug from me and one for you too. Bye-bye for now.
To subscribe, click here. And if you'd like to check out some more of our videos, click here.